September 26, 1983. 12:14 a.m. Moscow time. Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov is 6 hours into his shift at Serpukhov 15, a secret Soviet bunker 60 miles south of Moscow. He commands the early warning system that watches for American nuclear missiles. At 12:14:32, the alarm sounds. The computer displays a single word in red: Zapusk, launch. One American intercontinental ballistic missile has been detected, launched from a base in the United States. Flight time to Moscow, 25 minutes. Soviet doctrine is clear. If the Americans launch, you have minutes, not hours, to launch a counterattack before your missiles are destroyed in their silos. The doctrine is called launch on warning. You don't wait to see if the missile is real. You launch back. Petrov has 26 seconds to decide. But then the computer updates. Not one missile. 5 missiles. Petrov's hand hovers over the phone that connects directly to Soviet military command. If he picks it up and reports an attack, the Soviet Union will launch 1,398 nuclear warheads at the United States. The United States will launch 1,152 warheads back. 3 billion people will die in the next 90 minutes. He has 26 seconds. This is not a story about bravery. It's a story about a system designed to end the world in seconds, and the one man who refused to trust it. This is the story of the 26 seconds that saved the world. To understand Petrov's decision, you need to understand the system he was watching. In 1983, the Soviet Union operated a constellation of satellites called Oko, Russian for eye. These satellites sat in elliptical orbits, watching the United States for the infrared signature of an ICBM launch. When a missile launches, its rocket motor burns at 3,000 degrees Celsius. That heat signature is visible from space. The Oko satellites were designed to detect it within 30 seconds of launch and relay the data to ground stations in the Soviet Union. The data went to Serpukhov 15, where Petrov sat. His job was to interpret the satellite data and decide, is this a real attack or a false alarm? But here's the problem. The Oko system was new. It had been operational for only 2 years, and it had a history of false alarms. In 1981, the system reported a U.S. missile launch. False alarm, it had detected sunlight reflecting off clouds. In 1982, it reported another launch. False alarm, a satellite malfunction. The engineers kept fixing the bugs, but the system was still unreliable. And there was another problem. The Oko satellites could only see part of the United States at any given time. If the Americans launched a full first strike, 1,000 missiles, the satellites would see it. But if they launched a limited strike to test Soviet defenses, the satellites might only see a handful. That's what Petrov saw on September 26th. 5 missiles, not 1,000, 5, and that's what made him suspicious. Because if the United States was going to launch a nuclear first strike, why would they launch 5 missiles? The U.S. had 1,000 Minuteman ICBMs in silos across Montana, Wyoming, and North Dakota. If they wanted to destroy the Soviet Union, they would launch all of them. 5 missiles made no sense, but Soviet doctrine didn't care about making sense. The doctrine said, if the satellites detect a launch, you report it. Command decides what to do next. The protocol was designed to be fast. Satellite detects launch, ground station confirms, report to command, command orders, counterattack, Soviet missiles launch. Total time, 15 minutes. Petrov had 26 seconds to decide whether to start that chain. And the clock was ticking. September 26, 1983 was not a normal night. It was the most dangerous autumn of the Cold War. 3 weeks earlier, on September 1st, Soviet fighters had shot down Korean Airlines Flight 007, a civilian 747 that had strayed into Soviet airspace. 269 people died, including a U.S. congressman. President Reagan called it an act of barbarism. The Soviets claimed the plane was a spy mission. Tensions were at a breaking point. And then, in early November, just 6 weeks after Petrov's incident, NATO launched a military exercise called Able Archer 83. It was a war game designed to simulate NATO's response to a Soviet invasion of Western Europe, culminating in the simulated use of nuclear weapons. But the Soviets didn't know it was a simulation. Declassified CIA documents reveal that Soviet intelligence believed Able Archer 83 might be a cover for a real NATO first strike. The Soviets put their nuclear forces on high alert. They dispersed bombers to remote airfields. They armed nuclear warheads on SS-20 missiles in East Germany. The KGB sent an urgent cable to its stations in Western Europe. Watch for signs that NATO is preparing a nuclear attack. The signs included increased activity at NATO headquarters, encrypted communications, movement of nuclear weapons. All of those signs were present during Able Archer 83, because it was a war game. But the Soviets thought it might be real. And here's the terrifying part. The Soviets had a plan for what to do if they believed NATO was about to strike. It was called preemptive launch. If Soviet intelligence concluded that a NATO attack was imminent, they would launch their missiles first, before NATO could destroy them. In November 1983, the Soviet Union came within hours of launching a preemptive nuclear strike on Western Europe. We know this because of Oleg Gordievsky, a KGB colonel who was secretly working for British intelligence. Gordievsky was in the room when Soviet leadership discussed Able Archer 83. He later told MI6 they thought it was real. They were preparing to launch. Gordievsky's warning reached President Reagan. Reagan was shocked. He wrote in his diary, "I don't see how they could believe that, but it's something to think about." September 26, 1983, the night Petrov saw 5 missiles on his screen, was 3 weeks after Cal 007 and 6 weeks before Able Archer 83. The Soviets were on edge. They were looking for signs of an American attack, and then the alarm went off. 12:14:32 a.m. The alarm sounds. Petrov's screen shows 1 missile launched from the United States. He has 26 seconds to decide whether to report it. Let's walk through his options. Option 1, report the launch immediately. Soviet protocol says, trust the system. The satellites detected a launch. Report it, let command decide. If Petrov reports it, here's what happens. His report goes to General Yuri Votintsev at Soviet Air Defense Headquarters. Votintsev reports to the General Staff. The General Staff reports to General Secretary Yuri Andropov. Andropov has 5 minutes to decide. Is this real? Do we launch back? 5 minutes. That's how long Soviet leadership would have to decide whether to end the world. But there's a problem. Andropov is sick. He's been in and out of the hospital all year. He's paranoid, exhausted, and convinced the Americans are planning a first strike. If Petrov reports a launch, Andropov might believe it, and if Andropov believes it, he might launch back. Option 2. Wait and verify. Petrov knows the OKO system has a history of false alarms. He knows the satellites are unreliable. He knows that 5 missiles, not $1,000, doesn't make sense for a U.S. first strike. But if he waits and the attack is real, Soviet missiles will be destroyed in their silos before they can launch. The Soviet Union will be defenseless. Millions will die. Petrov has ground-based radar stations that can confirm the launch. But the radar won't see the missiles for another 15 minutes. They need to rise above the horizon first. By the time the radar confirms, it will be too late to launch a counterattack. So Petrov has to decide now. Trust the satellites or trust his gut. He looks at the screen. 1 missile, then 5. Then the system updates again. 5 confirmed launches. His subordinates are shouting, "Sir, we have a launch. We need to report." Petrov picks up the phone. Not the red phone to command, the internal phone to his technical staff. "Check the satellites," he says. "Are they functioning correctly?" "Yes, sir. All systems nominal." "Check again." The technician checks. The satellites are working. The infrared signatures are real. 5 missiles launched from U.S. bases. Petrov puts down the phone. He makes his decision. He does not report the launch. He later said, "I had a funny feeling in my gut. The system was new. It had malfunctioned before. And 5 missiles made no sense. If the Americans were going to attack, they would launch everything." This felt wrong, so he waited. 1 minute passed. 5 minutes. 10 minutes. The ground-based radar stations came online. They scanned the horizon. Nothing. No missiles, no launches, no attack. It was a false alarm. The OCO satellites had mistaken sunlight reflecting off high-altitude clouds for the infrared signature of a missile launch, the same glitch that had caused false alarms in 1981 and 1982. Petrov had been right, but if he had been wrong, 200 million people would have died. You might think Petrov was hailed as a hero. He wasn't. The Soviet military launched an investigation, not into the satellite malfunction, into Petrov. The investigators concluded that Petrov had violated protocol. He should have reported the launch immediately. The fact that it turned out to be a false alarm was irrelevant. His job was to report, not to decide. Petrov was reprimanded. He was reassigned to a less sensitive post. His career was over. He later said, "I was made a scapegoat. The system had failed, but they needed someone to blame, so they blamed me." But here's the thing. The Soviet military also didn't want anyone to know how close they had come to launching a nuclear war by mistake. So they buried the incident. It was classified. Petrov was forbidden from talking about it. For 15 years, almost no one outside the Soviet military knew what had happened on September 26, 1983. The story finally came to light in 1998, after the Cold War ended. A Russian journalist interviewed Petrov and published the account. Western media picked it up. The headline, "The Man Who Saved the World." In 2004, the Association of World Citizens gave Petrov an award in a ceremony at the United Nations. In 2006, he was honored in a documentary called "The Man Who Saved the World." Petrov was uncomfortable with the attention. He said, "I was just doing my job. I'm not a hero. I was in the right place at the right time, and I made the right decision. That's all." He died in 2017 at age 77 in a small apartment outside Moscow. He lived on a pension of $200 a month. The world never knew how close it came. Petrov's incident was not unique. It was one of dozens of nuclear close calls during the Cold War. Let me show you how fragile the system was. January 21, 1968, Thule Air Base, Greenland. A U.S. B-52 bomber carrying 4 hydrogen bombs crashes on the ice. The conventional explosives in the bombs detonate, scattering radioactive plutonium across the ice. One bomb is never fully recovered. The crash happens 800 miles from Soviet territory. Soviet radar detects the explosion. For several minutes, Soviet commanders believe it might be a nuclear detonation, a U.S. attack. They prepare to launch a counterattack. Then they realize it's an accident. How close were they to launching? We still don't know. The Soviet records remain classified. September 18, 1980, Damascus, Arkansas. A U.S. Air Force technician is performing maintenance on a Titan II ICBM. He drops a wrench socket. It falls 70 feet, punctures the missile's fuel tank. Fuel leaks. 8 hours later, the missile explodes, blowing the 740-ton silo door 200 feet into the air. The missile carries a 9-megaton thermonuclear warhead, the most powerful weapon in the U.S. arsenal. The warhead is thrown clear of the silo and lands in a ditch. It does not detonate. If it had, it would have vaporized a 50-mile radius. January 25, 1995. Norwegian Sea. Norway launches a research rocket to study the aurora borealis. The rocket's trajectory takes it over Russian airspace. Russian radar detects it. The radar signature looks like a U.S. Trident missile launched from a submarine, the kind that carries nuclear warheads. The Russian military wakes President Boris Yeltsin. They hand him the Cheget, the nuclear briefcase. Yeltsin has 5 minutes to decide whether to launch a counterattack. For the first and only time in history, a Russian president activates the nuclear briefcase. Russian submarines prepare to launch. Then, at the last second, Russian radar confirms the rocket is headed away from Russia, not toward it. Yeltsin stands down. The Norwegians had notified Russia about the rocket launch weeks earlier, but the notification never reached the radar operators. A bureaucratic failure. 5 minutes from nuclear war. There are more. In 1979, a U.S. early warning system reported a full-scale Soviet attack. It was a training tape accidentally loaded into the system. In 1980, a faulty computer chip reported 2,200 Soviet missiles inbound. False alarm. In 1962, a Soviet submarine nearly launched a nuclear torpedo during the Cuban Missile Crisis. The captain was overruled by 1 vote. We know of at least 20 nuclear close calls during the Cold War. There are probably more that remain classified, and in every case, the world was saved not by the system, but by a human who refused to trust it. Petrov, Yeltsin, a Soviet submarine officer named Vasily Arkhipov, a U.S. radar operator who double-checked a false alarm. Petrov said it best. The system was designed to launch in minutes, but humans need time to think. We built a system that didn't give us time to think. That's insane. The Cold War ended in 1991. The Soviet Union collapsed. The nuclear arsenals were reduced. But the systems are still there. The satellites, the radars, the missiles in silos, ready to launch in minutes. And the next Petrov might not be in the right place at the right time.